everybody. Um, yeah, so obviously I'm Councilor Harris, and this is
Councilor Killen. Hello, everyone.
woohoo.
Happy
Um,
Wednesday.
yeah, happy Wednesday, happy Hump Day, and we're excited you're joining us tonight. I'm just bringing up the comment section here. Obviously, anybody who's done this with us before knows you can type in comments from anywhere, and we can see them on Facebook or Twitter. And just in case anybody wants to share this, we're going to be recording this. It's just going to live on Facebook and Twitter here for a few months anyway. And tonight's big chat is housing. And obviously, this has been a hot button issue. There we go. I'm going to bring us in closer here for a second. We've got a couple of guests we're going to bring in tonight. We're really excited to bring in Jody Kliffer, who's the executive director of the St. John Land Bank, as well as Julia Woodhull-Melnik later on. And she's Canada Research Chair for Housing at UNB St. John. So she's certainly an expert in the field. And yeah, but what I thought would be good, and what Councilor Killen and I were talking before, was just giving a recap. Where did we start? A year and a half ago. We've been on council for almost 18 months. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Joanna, if you want to just give a bit of a recap on like when we were running back in 2021, and then when we got in, what was the lay of land? Where did we start from where you stood?
Well, it's interesting now, and I've learned more since we put this housing motion forward about the history of sort of housing in St. John. But from our perspective, from when we got there, it really became an issue, I think, in 2021. In 2020, I think it was there. It was beginning to become evident. But in 2021, when we arrived, the Growth and Community Services team at the city had already sort of put into the works a affordable housing action plan sort of study to be undertaken. Because it was in August, actually, when we first got that first sort of, okay, should we do this? Let's get going of 2021. It'll probably take a year. And we were unanimously agreed across the board to undertake this initiative to understand the landscape of what we need, and then sort of what we need to do subsequent to that. So cut to 2022, and we have all this new information in our hands beginning this summer. And the big thing was, and that's always on our minds when we're thinking about issues, is who's going to be responsible for this thing. One thing I've learned being in government is that sometimes plans can be made with all good intentions in the world, but unfortunately, when it comes to actually resourcing them, that can be a bit of an issue when it comes down to it. So our intention was to look at how things like this are implemented in other places. How does this work around the world? What are some good examples? Because it's a lot of great work, and it was a year of stakeholder engagement and a year of working with an action plan team that was made up of, experts in their fields. So to waste that time and effort just felt very, very, very problematic. So it would be, I guess, 3 or 4 months ago now, after we got that first draft, that we looked at, okay, so how are we going to understand who can best do this, which is where we came up with the motion, which came out last Monday's council, which was to get the city manager to investigate how we can create a municipal housing entity that will action the housing plan and also address any other initiatives that may come up as a result of the housing crisis. And it's important to note that St. John definitely has not historically been a place that has had such a high demand. I was told a story about a West Side area that has apartments on Manawaganish Road that at one point they were advertising a month free rent just to get people to live there. And that was just 10 years ago. So, we have changed, we have shifted, but this trend is pretty broad. It's pretty prolific across the world. So I don't think we're going to avoid it, and not addressing it head on, I don't think was an option for either of us. And obviously all of council, because they unanimously approved that we go and look at this. So was that a fair enough?
That's a good synopsis. I think the other part to all this is like we started this when people were really just starting to move here during the pandemic, trying to get out of big cities and try to get to a more affordable city. It's funny, I go back to when I ran for the Greens and housing being one of those priorities. And even that was back in 2020, during the pandemic. And it was really that early onset, need for housing justice for people as things were becoming more affordable back then. It's just been exacerbated every year since then. And, I remember finding this statistic, and it was almost a canary in the coal mine. I remember finding this Maclean's magazine article that talked about, the best cities in Canada to live in. And St. John scored number 14 on the list of cities, and that was fine. But the Maclean's article came with these sliders where you could say, okay, well, I'm going to prioritize affordability. I'm going to prioritize low crime rate, and I'm going to prioritize quality of life. There were other things on there. You could prioritize. You could say education was a priority, recreation was a priority. There were, I think, 7 or 8 different categories. But anyway, when I slided them over for, my top priorities being affordability, crime rate, and quality of life, St. John instantly became number 1 city. And I thought to myself, man, like how has nobody discovered this hidden gem? And it turns out they did. And it turns out we're growing more rapidly than ever, and not just by assessments. I know everybody's crazy mad about their assessments.
Yep.
Let me just say the tax bill is just as important as the tax rate and the tax assessment. So what do I mean by that? I mean, who cares if your house is worth $500,000 or $200,000 if your tax bill is, thousands of dollars different. And, St. John has some pretty unique realities. We won't get into all of them right now, but I think back then, even then, it was discovering that, St. John is a very affordable place with quite a low crime rate, which even when we've gone to conferences and we've talked to other people and we say, yeah, St. John's got one of the lowest crime rates in the country, people can't believe it. They're like, what? St. John? I'm like, oh, look it up.
Well, that's really important. And I think there's 2 other numbers that are like ringing with me all the time recently. One is from the province that said there's been 14,000 New Brunswickers added in the last year.
Right.
Huge. The other one was a headline in a newspaper that said there are 10,000 immigrants on a wait list to come to New Brunswick. So we have so much we need to build for that to be able to be managed. And I think that, in all of this, we are widely positioned as a place that is growing, especially due to where the port is headed, breaking records and the amounts of cargo that's here. And you probably see it as you drive across the bridge. The west side has never had so many Hapag Lloyd, canisters there. And so as all of this wonderful stuff is happening, we need there to be places for people to live. So the needs assessment is very clear that we do not have the housing stock that we need. So
and we can't build them fast enough, and we go through the issues, right? We have more homeless people now than we did before. We are not building as fast as Moncton and Fredericton are. We have Canada's oldest construction companies here, but yet for the past 20 years, St. John hasn't been a hot development area. So the level of complexity that our construction companies have, and I mean, let's face it, we haven't been inspiring our next generation in our schools to attack this problem head on. Right. We've inspired them to go and be, to earn top wages and to become, white collar professionals for the past 50 years. But we've cut shop classes out of schools. We've given people no major incentive to join the workforce but we really, those are things that we need to tackle now, is to say, how do we inspire people to solve the housing crisis?
Well, there's all these issues, right? And I think this entity is something that can be a place for those issues to land and be dealt with, versus now, which is we don't have anything.
Yeah. So we want to flesh out this municipal housing entity. So for anybody who's just chiming in now, we're going to bring in Jody Kliffer here in just a second, but I just wanted to kind of recap this. Over the past year, there have been a couple of motions I've brought to council to try to push on the municipal envelope. So what it is that we can do at the municipal level to improve the housing construction builds, to improve the streamlining the process to building houses, to incentivizing that, to pursuing, one of the things that I harp on, and I harped on when I was running for council, was Section 137 of the Local Governance Act, which gives municipalities the right to repair buildings and upload those to the province. It's not been something that's been done. It's laid out in legislation, but it will take kind of some bold positioning from the from the city to do that. We've asked the city man. I put a motion on to ask the city manager to investigate a municipal housing, ghost house tax, for lack of a better word. So, if your building's abandoned, that you get taxed at a different rate. Because if I'm a landlord and I have my building occupied and I'm contributing to solving the housing crisis, somebody who's leaving theirs abandoned shouldn't be given a free ride, shouldn't be taxed less than somebody who is. So that's something that the city is currently investigating, and all of those different conversations, obviously, Joanna, that you led with growth committee and trying to figure out some of this needs assessment stuff, all of it led to us kind of joining forces to figure out, okay, what would it be if we could do one thing at the municipal level? What would that be to try to galvanize and coordinate and to stand something up that would really focus on housing? And so that came 2 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago now. I'm trying to,
just a week and a half because of the Mondays, just
right.
not,
yeah. So council before last,
yeah,
we brought that motion, did a lot of work in the background, took us 3-4 months.
yeah. Y'all can read it. It's all out there on the internet.
Yeah. Do you want to read it right now, what we brought?
No, it's very long. But if anyone wants to go and read this ridiculous,
oh yeah, the whole thing, yeah,
the whole thing, yeah,
yeah.
But there's tons of detail in there, and it does talk a lot about the history of housing. So someone who's been really involved in this space is our next guest, Mr. Jody Kliffer. So
we're gonna bring him on now. So Jody is coming to us. I'm just gonna pop him up here. Just give me 1 second. Reduce that, and there we go. Jody, how you doing?
Hey guys, how you doing? How's it going?
Welcome.
Good.
Thanks.
So we've got 8 or 9 people on here so far. They're coming and going. I had to share a different link on Facebook, just on Twitter, because I don't know what's going on with the Twitter feed. But this is going to be a conversation that's going to live on. So we wanted to really try to capture, where you're at. What is the land bank? What is it that you guys have been doing for the past 4 years? To really lean into this issue of housing in the city, and where do you fit? And I think where we really want the conversation to go eventually is what do you see as the problems?
Well, thanks for having me on. First of all, it's great to be here. And where I'm at right now is coming to you from mid-century, mid-20th century, as you can notice from my wallpapering. And this has been my headquarters through COVID. So
nice.
Yeah, no, look, I everything you're saying resonates with me strongly. Prior to my previous role, as you know, I was involved with the city in the planning department, was on the team that built the Plan SJ and Zone SJ and some of the incentive programs that came out of those initiatives. So I would say that there's been great effort in the city from a policy perspective in trying to invigorate the economy over those dark periods that were prior to now, which anybody watching this knows that.
Mm-hmm.
It was, like you say, the landlords giving away rent or other incentives to get people to live in places. It was, and I was a landowner a few years ago, and I tell you, it was like almost overnight. We went from having to struggle with an empty unit for a few months and whatever, and you make the best of it, do some work, to having 20 people to choose from for your unit. It was shocking. So there certainly is a significant amount of pressure on residential units right now in the city, and the reason, at least part of the reason, is it's because it doesn't start in St. John, and it never did.
Right.
When you compare St. John to every relevant category across the country in terms of city size, that's small to medium sized cities, the rest of them have already tapped out the good investment phase when real estate values were low. And cities like Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver were bursting at the seams. People were scrambling to find those other places to live. Well, they're all done. And that St. John was the last bastion, maybe one of 2 or 3, that was competitive in terms of entry point. And that's why it seemed to me like this the boom bust cycle in St. John historically, we went through this in 2008-9 when there was a plans for second refinery. Prices went through the roof, right? If you were a landlord, you're like, I am, what's his name, Mr. McDuck, but then all of a sudden plans were canceled, and so we went to bust cycle. We relied back. It was a false economy. The thing with this scenario is it's irrelevant of the
Right.
local economy. Yeah, you're right. The container ships are setting records. There's lots of jobs going on, but I don't think that even matters. Like, you have all these, you have the silver economy right now, just scrambling to find places where their dollars make the most sense. And they come to the East Coast to see the lifestyle. They see where they can work remotely. They can retire here. They can winter down south. I just think it's the reshuffling of the decks in terms of people across the country, and these types of cities are starting to gain momentum, and it's not going to go away, which is
Right.
both a good and bad thing depending on how things pan out for us.
So were you surprised? I don't know if you saw this, about how the age brackets have skewed younger for the latest group of folks coming here. So
no, I guess in context of what I just said,
Yeah.
it might sound like I am, but no, I think it sort of starts with that age bracket's a bit older, but it's consistent across other categories. Like, once you start becoming a bit more of a cool city, then it doesn't just appeal to that older demographic. It starts to become something that the younger folks are attracted to as well. And I think that's almost directly a result of the initiatives that City Hall has taken in the last 15 years, with some of their direct intentions around focusing on the uptown and South End. And we got flack for that back in the day, but it was because we had limited resources and limited abilities, and we said, let's just pick one thing and focus on it and do a good job with it. And I think that credit to the planning department and the leadership there, because I think they've gotten that one right. And that's where you're seeing the younger demographic come in instead, because they see things uptown that are happening: coffee shops, restaurants, bars, events, green spaces that are taken care of. We can always do better in those categories, but we can say comfortably that we're a pretty cool city for the size we're at.
Yeah, we're certainly envied by other cities in some of the events. I mean, obviously, you're very involved with the Moonlight Bazaar. There's the Area 506. Memorial Cup was a big boon for the city here and bringing a lot of attention here. But I wanted to, drill into the land bank and what it is that you guys are doing now. You guys have been around since, is it 2019 or 2018 that you guys started?
Officially 2017 is when we were
17. Okay.
incorporated.
Yep.
But and I know you led with that question. I just couldn't help myself. The other parts of the conversation were interesting, so
Jump in. Yeah.
didn't want to pass on them.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so really, land banking is a concept born out of American, mostly post-industrial East Coast cities, although it's expanded now to be a national initiative. And really, they experienced decline on a scale that we can't compare ourselves to. Fannie Mae crisis back 2007-8, the housing crisis in America. Minimal banking regulations. They were giving out mortgages like candy, and Canada, being a more social democracy, has heavily regulated banking environment. So we didn't experience that. However, what it did, so let's sort of back up for a second. So what it did was the cities were given the powers from the state to actively take over title of properties that were troubled, that are tax delinquent, they're derelict properties or abandoned properties, and they're contributing to the neighborhood decline once they start to enter the stages of abandonment. And we all know that once one building's abandoned, it's only a matter of time before another one in the same block or same neighborhood gets abandoned. And it just escalates until you're in a situation where the neighborhood is uncontrollably declining and investment is petering out. So they took a very aggressive role at the municipal level and said, we're going to start land banking, which is an arm's length government organization that takes over title, clears taxes, and repurposes property for the highest and best use for the community. Why that's important is because the way it currently works here and the way it used to work there is that once a property has been foreclosed, meaning that the owners have not paid their taxes, it's gone into receivership from the lien, normally the state, but often also the bank. The process ends with some type of an auction where somebody, if they want to, can bid on the property, and the goal for the lien holder is to get back as much money as possible on the lost investment, which would be the mortgage usually. And they don't care about the community. They don't care about the streetscape. They just need to salvage as much as possible they can get back from that investment. And then how do you do?
Right.
And so land banking came in and said, look, we don't care about getting money back. Yeah, it's great. We'll try to recover what we can when it makes sense. But what we care about is stabilizing the decline of neighborhoods and repurposing land for effective community-oriented means. So whether that's a community garden, a green space, affordable housing, which is a popular outcome, or even some cases private sector reinvestment. That's also something that we can't ignore as part of that community mosaic that builds a strong, stable community.
Can I just jump in there just real quick? Because I want to drill into one myth that I'm really hearing a lot, that, you know, if the nonprofit sector, so if the government chooses to take action in the housing sector, whether it be standing up something like what we're talking about, a municipal housing entity, or funding, you know, affordable housing. I mean, certainly the Telegraph Journal made this serious misnomer, in my opinion,
No,
basically saying it's an all or nothing equation. If you're either for the nonprofit sector or the public housing sector, which means you're building ghettos,
That
or
we're
you're for the
building
private sector.
ourselves. That was a big thing. That the
Yeah.
citizens would start being landlords. Yeah.
And so can you walk me through that? Like when you're talking about land banks playing this coordinating role to solve problems of housing, how does that, what does that look like maybe for land banks to support private development?
Well, so from a land bank, where they exist usually, and there are a lot of different things in a lot of different states. So I'll summarize it with like the majority presence of land banks, but there's always different executions of land banks that have different powers. But typically they're arm's length for governments. They don't have any decision making that needs to be vetted through council, right? That's a no-no for land banking, because you don't want to have something that needs to operate fast and with community interest in mind and on their own budget and their own policies to have to go through that process, because it can be gruesome at times and slows things down.
Right.
Although it needs to be in line with the municipal government and their growth policies and their initiatives. So really what a land bank does is it sets its own table with like, here's what, obviously board of directors. And a lot of them in the states, they must have one or two council members on their board of directors. So there is transparency there. So there's some, and also there's depending on the state, you know, you have to have a certain number of professionals and community members and people from the communities that you're targeting, what have you. But they'll have their own environment of policy directions on how you acquire properties, how you disposition yourself of properties, how you maintain properties, which we do too at the St. John Land Bank. We've spent a good amount of time building that policy environment. So that really sets the sort of parameters. And if we own a property, like let's take a 141 Victoria Street in the North End, that's up. It's ours. It's up for, let's say, purchase. If somebody has a proposal, they come to us, they propose it. The board looks it over. I would write a recommendation as the project manager, and they would make a decision. If there's competing interests, and the board decides from that perspective. So it's really, we're the landholder with our policies directing us to think of the highest and best use for the community, not for profit. And what is the outcome? Is it, and let's say, imagine a world we have like one group that wants to do a community garden, and this other not-for-profit wants to do, maybe let's say Habitat for Humanity wants to build a home. Then the board has an interesting discussion to make.
Yeah.
Right. So they have to make this decision around what's better. And I can't tell you what it would be without knowing the actual proposals. But we would take that under consideration, vet it against our policies and what's on the ground, and have a discussion around it. So what we do, to answer your original question, is we do the same thing they try to do in the States. We target abandoned and derelict properties mostly, that to repurpose them, those spaces for community outcomes. And we are just about to be capitalized. So our funding channels are a little complicated, but it ultimately comes through CMHC and plays a little bit of a hot potato before it gets to us. And that has yet to be signed off on, although it should have been signed off on a few months ago. So it's really kind of any day sort of thing.
Right.
And we've acquired properties through the province in the past when the economy wasn't what it was right now. And they would be anything that they deemed surplus, they would come to us and say, do you want this property? We would say, yes, here's the property. And they'll forgive back owed taxes to us if it doesn't go through tax sale and it comes through a different mechanism. they've offered that service to forgive taxes if we can repurpose the property. So we end up holding properties in our ownership. Our goal is not to hold them for long. We don't want to hold on to property for a long time. Our goal is to get them back to productive use. So we've been able to do that. We've made 2 or 3 sales in the past year that are going to be, one is to a private developer, but the condition of sale was we'll give you a discount on the sale if you can sign an agreement that you'll put affordable housing in your project. We're not saying you have to do everything affordable. We're not even saying how much. It's going to be a big project. So, and they were willing because they were going to do it anyway. They told me, but they said, yeah, we'll sign whatever you want to sign. Love to do it. So they're going to do that. Now, another sale we did recently was to another not-for-profit that wants to do affordable housing for at-risk youth. So we discounted that sale down to $1 because that checked a lot of boxes in terms of outcome, and we were happy to partner with them. So we're working hard in 2 different directions. And also right now I'm finalizing a negotiation with some property in the south end we're going to buy. We're out. It got to the point in the south end where we said, you know what, gloves are off. Like, this is now becoming a real problem, an entry point for getting land and getting affordable housing in the south end. So we saw an opportunity, said, well, let's just go and make a bid, and that's going to be finalized hopefully here within a week, I expect. So now we don't have a partner yet for that, but we will now start shopping at partners over the next couple of years to get the project in the ground.
But you have it in the bank, which is just, if you think about it super simply, it makes so much sense.
That's right.
Yeah. And that allows, an entity like yours, a land bank, to control land and to come up with a more coordinated philosophical approach to the type of neighborhood, the type of building that's needed, which people it serves. I think that's a big question. The market, we always talk about the market, like Joanna, you and I were at the 8 Cities conference. We listened to an economist go on at length saying the market is not responding. It's not reacting the way it normally would when there's such a shortage, and it's been going on for too long. So there's no reason to think the market will be able to react. So there, his sense was we need new things involved in this process to help kickstart or reset the market. But I think, this is important, is like the market is not building the types of units that we need. And the market really has capital tied up in a lot of high-end units because the margins are there for profit for those who are seeking to make money and return on their investment. So what you guys are doing, from the sounds of it, allows a bit of a philosophical exit point, right?
You're right. And I think what the important feature is, and this is I haven't touched on this yet, and it's really important in thinking about the concept of what we do as a land bank. You hit the nail on the head. Pardon the pun. Construction construction takes a long time, and I don't hit nails on the head. By the way, when I owned that apartment building, man, I had some bruises on my nails. But it's so let's take the Wellington, for example, off Union. I don't know. I'm going to say 6 years from concept to open the doors.
Yeah,
it's a great project. I support that one. They did a great job. The acres, their design's fantastic. But the problem is from an affordable housing perspective is that's 6 years for, I don't know what it is, 30 units that are going to be affordable. You guys probably know better than I do. That's not a lot of units per year you're getting to address this problem. But what we're arguing with the land bank is you don't have to build a damn thing. They're already built. You just have to change the legislation. And at any given moment, the city's monitoring in their dangerous and vacant program 150 buildings with X number of units. Some of them are single family, some are multiple units. Certainly in urban core, they're typically 3 to 5. But you don't have to, if you can just get them over to the land bank before they deteriorate so much that they're knocked down.
Right.
So you just need to what we've done. The legislation is decades old, and they know this. The province knows it. They agree. Like there's not like someone saying, well, no, this is really important that we do it, and it takes 15 years. No, nobody thinks that. But the challenge is in Canadian winters, your buildings aren't going to survive that many winters.
Right.
And we've done everything in this society, especially when these policies are written, to enshrine the owner of private property. That is a critical function of a capitalist economy, that you need to have somebody who owns property. Ever since John Locke wrote that in whatever 17th century, like that has been a cornerstone. So you can have people without a home sleeping in front of a building that's boarded up, because a right to a house is not as important as a right to private property.
The superior goes to the owner. That is wild to think about.
Yeah.
That
So
way.
when you think about it, like from an alien's perspective,
Yeah.
It makes no sense. Like, yeah, sure. I'm not saying take away property from somebody who just is going through some hard times, but the rate of return of somebody who's been tax delinquent for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, of them suddenly becoming on board with paying taxes and cleaning everything up and going back to being a productive property, the return value is like about zero.
Well, the data must.
I haven't done that. I don't have the access to the information to do that research, but the on the ground.
From a business perspective, they are incredibly upside down, right? They are now costing the city services. They are now costing our fire department. Our fire department has to go by these buildings, inspect them once a month. You know, there's more crime that happens around them. The broken window theory makes that clear. So it's like from a communitarian perspective, the fiscal solvency of, you know, somebody who's been tax delinquent on their building for 2 years they're upside down for all of us.
Well,
and
yeah,
that's what I don't get, is there's so many people who have pushed back, and the Telegraph Journal is one of them, and I'm going to keep hammering on them. But when we brought this municipal housing entity to say, look, we need more people in the sandbox who are coordinating things like the land bank is doing, not doing exactly what you're doing, but like coordinating a different piece of the puzzle to drive, you know, to advocate, to drive funding, to coordinate funding, to line it, to quarterback, you know, developments to people, to design them, all of that. We need that in order to prevent the community from being overrun by these types of realities. Right. And it's baffling to me that people will continue to defend that status quo and say, well, what are you going to do next? You're going to tell us where to live? Like, and they're kind of lost in the minutia, right?
Well, it's like this concept of being stewards of property instead of being owners of property. So if we can all accept that as people in community, when we own a place, we own a home, we are just temporary people here, right? And I think it's interesting the way the city recognizes folks who do well on heritage properties, like they have awards and stuff like that. And I think that kind of mindset is important, that you don't own this forever. Like, you don't. Mm-hmm. And the way that we look at our policy, and from a provincial perspective especially, it can take up to 5 years to undo one of these properties and get the release on that. So
we've always said, it's always been the case that like the community in the heritage area has accepted that if you live there, that you live inside the home and that's yours, but you don't own the facade. We own the facade. And so what you're saying is just an extension of that, to say, well, hold on, you don't live forever. So you're actually just holding this for year one in a daisy chain of people that are gonna enjoy this space.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's
it goes against capitalism.
We need to get more socialist sort of outcomes in housing for sure. And I'm not saying we need to be a communist country, but we need to have some more socialist programs that govern the experience of housing, because you leave it all to the jaws of capitalism. And I don't think that you'll see a lot of problems. And look, America's exactly an example of that, and what they went through. And so my takeaway from studying that back in my grad school days was, geez, a good thing that we don't have the type of banking system, which is like hyper capitalistic in the States. Like we have a bit more policy driven, but at the same time, it points it's definitively points to faults in our own system that aren't yet being highlighted because we don't have the problem, but we still have the process that's broken. So why wait for a crisis before you fix a broken system? We don't need a crisis in housing before we go, maybe we should change legislation so it doesn't take 15 years for a delinquent property owner to be, to be challenged. Right?
What blows my mind on this, Jody, is, we learned, and so Julia Woodhull's here in the background. I'm going to bring Julia in here in a second. And just for people who are in the background here, just so you know, Julia Woodhull is the Canada Research Chair for Housing out of UNBSJ. I don't know if she's home yet or if she's still in Hamilton, but she was just in McMaster giving a chat. So we're kind of having this roundtable. But I wanted to pick up on this. Like, what blows my mind about this is 50 plus years ago, we realized that the best outcomes for healthcare were based on bringing it in-house and socializing healthcare. And nobody in the world, there isn't one person in the world that I can find that makes a coherent argument that is backed up on good data and research that says, no, we should go back to a privatized model.
Mhm.
Yet healthcare is literally secondary to housing. It is the second thing that you like. Sure, you need good healthcare. There's no question, but you need a roof over your head.
Right.
And it's just like anyway, this conversation, I heard you say you talked about socialist policies and outcomes for housing, but I think it really does come down to we need a better return, like to use their language, to use capitalistic language. We need a better return on investment for our society on the money that goes from our pockets and the productivity that goes out of our community that gets trapped by a lack of housing, a lack of affordable housing, and holds people back because they don't have secure housing. Anyway, I'm going to get off my pulpit here. I want to bring Julia. I want to bring Julia in here. Just 1 second. Julia, there you are.
Hey, folks.
Oh.
Sorry I'm late to
Hey.
the party. Still putting some kids to bed.
That's all good. That's all good. I know you're jumping. Jody's just been walking us through a little bit of the land bank, what its history is, what they're doing, and then we got into a little back and forth there on some of this. But I would love for you to give yourself an introduction to people. There's about 15 people, 16 people who are kind of live right now, and this will be recorded, so we'll continue to post it and talk about it.
Great. Thanks, folks. And Jody was I was absolutely loving a few of the things I was hearing hiding out in the backstage there. So couldn't agree with you more. So I'm Julia Woodhull-Melnik. I'm an associate professor at UNBSJ, and I am a Canada Research Chair in Resilient Communities with a focus on housing. So I've been a housing researcher for about the past 12 years or so. And like Jody, have spent a lot of time mulling around in the literature and trying to find some best solutions for us. And I guess I'll get straight into my newest best solution that I've kind of discovered through looking at Barcelona's city plan, some of the things they're doing in Vienna, some of the things they're doing in Copenhagen. Really has been to socialize housing. I think we're in a massive housing crisis right now. And the only way out is to stop making housing a commodity because it is a basic human right. And we all do have the right to housing. And actually, I discovered this past week at a workshop in Guelph, Ontario. So I was in Guelph giving a panel and then at McMaster giving a talk. And in Guelph, Ontario, we were working with some of the folks from the UN Secretariat and the Special Rapporteur on Housing. And really, we can start making legal cases for against things like rent evictions and forced evictions, because we have signed on to the UN agreement that housing is a human right. And not having access to affordable, decent housing that meets your basic need is a violation of your human rights. So we really have to start talking about it this way. So happy to hear what Jody was saying. And thanks for having me.
Yeah. So
Mic drop introduction right there. That is
there you go.
Amazing. Yeah.
Can we just talk about and maybe a couple of points from everybody, and I'll start. What are the barriers to building more housing faster? Now, obviously I've swung a hammer. Part of my background is I'm not, just for all clarity's sake, I am not a sealed licensed carpenter by any stretch of the imagination. So I fit into the unlicensed spectrum of the trades, but yet I worked in the construction industry for 16 years since I was about 14 years of age. And so I picked up a lot of skill sets, worked for a lot of very, very qualified people. And, one of the things we've always talked about is just the labor force that's in the construction industry is very haphazard. It's a lot of the time the kids who ended up in the shop class in the high schools were there because they were problem kids that, didn't fit into the more rigid system of education where you go, you sit in a seat and you read a book and you regurgitate and memorize information. But yet there was a lot of there wasn't a lot of inspiration to get into the trades. And that's something that we continue to see, the average age. So this is one barrier to building more housing in St. John. The average age of an apprentice, so somebody who's very skilled, is 32 in New Brunswick. And the uptake in our trades colleges is that very few of our electrician, plumber, mechanical, carpenter, insulator, whatever those licensed trades are that you can be, very few of them are full. So that's a major issue, getting the labor force piece. But that's not it, right? There's a lot of coordination problems here about what the types of buildings we're doing and all that. So that's my piece. We need to figure out a way. I brought it up at a conference recently. I said, I think trades college should be free. I think if you want to go and be a nurse and a doctor, it should be free. You should have to sign a 5-year contract to the province that pays for your education to stay in-house. That's one thing we could do. Take away the monetization of the education we need around that. But maybe I'll go to you next, Jody, and just what do you see as a major barrier that exists here in St. John to building more housing, or not even just more, but the right housing for the people who need it most?
Well, I mean, that's almost something I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on. But from my perspective, no matter what, even if you had all the I think you hit one for sure. I mean, the trades, there's not enough labor. There's a lack of labor, but there's a lack of supply chain. At least we're talking in recent years. And realistically, you can't come out with a product that's a new build that is affordable for anybody below middle class at a stretch. So I think really the product you're talking about has got to be subsidized. So is there supply chain availability? Is there labor locally available for the build? And is there government dollars to help get it off the ground if you want to target that cohort of the population that's below middle? Because you can't come out with what Percy Wilbur does in those properties and target your working poor. You just can't. And I'm sorry, but I don't think inclusionary zoning works. No. Not in this town. It does in Vancouver. It does well in Toronto. But when you target a town like this, you might get a couple units a year, and that's not going to even approach your outcomes.
That's
Julia?
certainly something we've heard.
Yeah. So it's interesting because my postdoc and I have been combing through articles across Canada, any articles that have been written for about 4 newspapers on the term rent evictions for the past couple weeks. And if you look at where the rhetoric that we don't have enough units comes from, it comes from landlords and developers. So really, I mean, we have to start looking at what's out there systematically. Let's take a look. How many Airbnbs do we have online in St. John? How many units do we have that aren't being rented out? How many units do we have that are just pricing people out? Let's take a good hard look at the stock. And I'm not saying that, we hear the rhetoric come from the federal government all the time that we need more housing stock, and we do hear it and we do need it. And I'm not doubting that, whatsoever. However, I think we need to start to take an inventory of what we have, and start going through some of our tax records. And I mean, there's units out there that are in, let's say, secondary suites in people's homes that don't count towards our double taxation quota, and they're not really counted officially in our units. And we need to know about those places. Right? Our Airbnbs, we don't necessarily know how many places we have that are being used by Airbnb. The other thing I have to say too is, Jody, I agree with you that construction needs to be subsidized, absolutely, for new builds. And that's a good way to go. I also think that public construction companies, if you're, with the Housing Corp idea,
right.
If we have public housing construction companies, then we now start looking at economies of scale, right? Which puts a little bit more ease for us in terms of purchasing power, all of that kind of stuff. And I do agree that construction needs to be subsidized, but if it's subsidized, then I think it needs to be held in the hands of government,
Yes.
not in the hands of or nonprofits,
Yeah.
but not in the hands of for-profit. Because basically then you're just talking about corporate welfare. And, I'm not interested in my tax dollars going to the rich anymore. So yeah, anyway, I'm happy to pay my taxes, but I really hope that, those subsidies start to be held in the hands as a public good that we invested in as the public.
The commons, the common money, the common, good.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, some of the programs we have right now, we're subsidizing places at $65,000 a door, $60,000 a door, which is fantastic. But then they enter into agreement for a specified amount of time. And then once that agreement's up, the private developer can take those and do whatever they want with them.
Yeah.
So whether it be 7, 10, 15, 20 years, at a point, you can take that unit and start flipping it into a for-profit. And in that case, we've just given them a whole bunch of taxpayers' money for a couple of years of help.
And it's sorry, I won't say anything. Joe, I'll go to you next. If there's any of those barriers to the housing we need, I guess, whether it be construction or whether it be something else.
Well, as you all know, we've been over this issue in 1,000 different ways. And one of the sort of main things I'm running up against, and I would love sort of all of your feedback on this, is just how, this problem just kind of came up, all of a sudden. We talked about this earlier. Why should we invest in housing, in an initiative or in an entity or whatever it is, in any sort of form? Because this could just all kind of go away in a certain amount of time. So I feel like there's a lot of economist types who are coming out of the woodwork to contribute to this conversation, because their interests seem to be more important than necessarily sort of the content of what they're saying. But the general thing from that community that I'm experiencing is, well, this is probably just going to go back to the way St. John was, 5 years ago.
Yeah. So the idea that this is not a crisis we're in. It'll figure itself out in 5 years.
Yeah. The market's going to take care of itself. Y'all don't have to be worried your pretty little heads about it kind of attitude. So I see you shaking your head. So I would love either of you.
Can I take this one? Yeah, I love this rhetoric. There we go. So yeah, definitely something that is a very interesting thing. So housing is a form of healthcare when you think about it, right? So what are we going to do? First off, I really don't think we don't often see massive deflation in markets. Like we really, really don't. Like if we think the gas prices are going to go back to 80 cents a liter eventually, they probably won't, to be quite honest with you. But one big thing that I'd like to say is in that 5-year gap, how much damage are we going to be doing to people and to families? How much educational potential, job potential, is going to be lost? How much stress are we going to be putting on people? We know housing is a form of healthcare. So think about all the money that we are going to have to spend after people spend 5 years completely stressed out, without access to opportunities for their families, without the quality of housing they need, living in a place with black mold for 5 years. It's going to send you for a couple trips to the general, that's for sure. And it's cheaper than actual healthcare, housing. So, I'd say start to look at the runoff effects of this stuff, right? Housing is shelter. It's shelter from storms. It's shelter from cold. And, at one point in time, we had people freezing to death on the streets of Toronto. Somebody freezing to death is a whole lot more expensive when you look at the response to that than subsidizing a unit for them.
Well,
plus it's also humane.
Yeah.
I don't want to live in a place with black mold for 5 years.
Right.
I don't want to be worried about getting evicted from my place for 5 years. The economy argument, okay, cool, fine. Let's look at the economic effects down the road. What effects are we going to have? And we actually have a research study that's working on that. in terms of linking in data to the New Brunswick Institute for Research, Data and Training that will actually be able to tell us a bit about the health outcomes of folks who have been unaffordably housed. So, we can start to assign dollar values to that. And that's just health. We can also look at education, involvement in the job market, mental health outcomes that we might not be seeing, adverse childhood experiences from family stress. So many things going down that hole. And on the other side of things, like I also say to economists, like, or people who are making the economic argument, let's say, a lot of economists would actually agree with me.
Right.
But people who are making the economic argument, what about doing the right thing? And also, what about human rights? So back to that again, too. Human rights are important as well, too.
Yes.
And I see Jody kind of like sighing at me.
So. Just send me for a mental tailspin. I'm like, I mean, it's an existential moment when you're in a conversation agreeing with economists. Are you wrong, like philosophically, with your life now suddenly, or like, are they coming toward you? Those are so few moments in my life where I'm talking to an economist and we're like lined up. Anyway, I agree with everything you're saying. And I find it's a good perspective on it. And it also made me think, like, and I said this for years, I spent a lot of time in my life in the hospital, but and really, I don't think we have healthcare. We have sick care, and I think if we just change the terminology, what you're talking about is healthcare.
Yeah.
Right. What you're talking about is healthcare, and building complete communities is healthcare, because there's walk-based trips in every high density community. What you do when you go to the hospital is sick care, because now you've gone too far in life, or something's happened to you that shouldn't have, and you're unlucky. But now you need to deal with that. But what we're talking about is actual healthcare. And if we just change the terminology, I think these initiatives would be easier for the public to digest and understand, like, what you're really talking about.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Just people, you buy a house, you own a home, like, you have a lot of pride and intention in that. So trying to communicate this to the broader audience, and that, this is better for all of us in the long run, because the social determinants of health are real. Like, I know that's the more sort of like technical term for it, but it is having a house, a roof over your head will save you healthcare costs, or save the taxpayers healthcare costs down the road, which I love. I do love bringing that up to economists. It is a fun one, because the amount that healthcare costs this country is astronomical. But if we can find a more economical solution, I hate making this argument, but it is true. Like, it is 100% true.
It's fair. Yeah.
So we should start to bring in like Barry Watson and Rob Moore into like these debates, because they are more like socially minded economists.
Yeah.
I used not to hate on economists at all.
Yeah.
No,
but
it would be really lovely to have them, help us produce some of these counter arguments, right?
Yeah.
Like, who better to fight against the economic argument than an economist?
Well,
right?
and I think it does come down to a narrative piece for me, right? Is that people have bought into the narrative that it's their productivity, it's their hard work, it's their, freedom and private, liberty that is leading to the goodness of a community. And it's like the old saying is true. If you see far, it's because you've stood on the shoulders of giants. It's like the people who built our communities didn't live that way. We could not have pioneered this country as rugged individualists, right? We cannot solve the housing crisis as entrepreneurs. You just can't. You can't solve the healthcare crisis as entrepreneurs. It's not to say entrepreneurs don't have a part to play, right? I'm an entrepreneur. Jody, you're an entrepreneur. We've all, like, many of us have started things. Joe, you started a number of things. It's just, we have to have a more communitarian mindset of saying, we're now going to collude resources. We're going to get together and put our resources for the best possible outcome. And I love what you were talking about earlier, Julia, and even dovetailing with what you're saying, Jody, is we don't need our money that we're contributing to the common good of our society to be in the hands of somebody who can't produce the product that we need, that won't support the people that need the help the most, because at the end of the day, people are all we have. And if we have people who are in places of goodness and they have a position of resiliency to come at life with, then they can in turn put their shoulder to the wheel of solving these problems. But it's a tired argument, and so many people have bought into it. Don't touch my stuff, leave my land alone, not in my backyard. But it comes from this like twisted consumeristic mindset where we actually think that type of mindset's going to solve any problems, and it's not. And it's so infiltrated this housing conversation. It's, we were both, Joanne and I were both really surprised to see the response from the editorials board about this idea to set up a municipal housing entity, because, they went from zero to communist just like that, where the idea was we're going to start to pull power right into the centralized state to like dictate what everybody does, which couldn't be further from the truth. So, that narrative piece is so important to capture.
I know we're going to finish soon, Brent. I just had a couple of
Yeah.
questions before we just trail off. And if you don't mind, Julia, you said something earlier, and you hear the term lot rent eviction, and I guess we intuitively know what you mean. But is there a working definition of that? Because as a previous landlord, we'd often do work in a building. Now, we wouldn't raise rents more than 10 or $15. Is there a threshold that academia works with to define that?
There's actually not yet. And I say yet because we are submitting the paper in 10 days. We have a deadline for a special issue of Housing Theory and Society, where we're actually working with we're working with all the citations that exist in academic literature. And then again, those 5 media sources across Canada. We've identified about 500 articles, and we're combing through to see what the definition looks like across those articles. And really, it's basically the act of or the intention to increase the rent due to basically evicting someone and then renovating and then renting out at another rate. But when we're looking through all these articles, they don't specify an amount, but they do specify the fact that it's exuberant, right? So it basically takes the household or the housing from being affordable, putting money into it, and then making it now, let's say, a middle to high end apartment or unit.
Right. I guess that's where it gets a little bit more qualitative for me, because you're gonna need to do work in your building eventually. And
Yes.
if you evict somebody because it's time to do it, now's the time, and you don't really make it unaffordable to current market standards, but you did work you needed to do to make your asset more valuable. To me, and I didn't do that for the record, but to me, that would be almost responsible land ownership to maintain a building the way it needs to be maintained. And would that fall in that sort of gray zone to be counted as rent eviction?
It could be gray zone, but it also depends on how you do it, right? So not everybody's, so rent evictions aren't always spoken of, like they're spoken of in the media as being like a bad thing. Like, look, they rent evicted and blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
But if you do them properly in ways that actually protect the tenants, they can be done well. So you can look at Regent Park in Toronto as a mass example of rent eviction, right? They basically said, you guys can't live here anymore. It's crap. We're going to redevelop. And in the meantime, we're going to move your household to this place. And then when it's time for the renovation or the big redevelopment to be done, you have right of first refusal for that unit.
Right.
So we found you an affordable place to live at the time. We've taken care of you. We've helped you. And, now when it's time to come back, you can tell us if you want to come back, right? Before we offer your unit to anyone else.
Right.
So that's kind of been so again, it's not to say that I honestly, upkeep needs to be done, right? Nobody wants to live in a crappy apartment.
No.
But yeah, it's the way you go about doing it.
Yeah, so it's behavioral, which is a little qualitative, but I think it has to be. The other thing
it's like the intention behind it. I would say you have to look at more of the intention.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to measure, but it's an important thing to discuss, because there's a million reasons why they happen, but the bad ones is what you're trying to identify.
We saw an example of a housing entity actually having a bit of a review board. So taking it away from the tenants. The tenants can't be rent evicted unless the landlords have been approved by going through and seeing what they're going to do, and then you can accept that.
And this is the solution, Joanna, that that the literature is pointing to, is take the onus off of the tenant to say, right now they have to go out and say, look, I'm being unfairly rent evicted, so this guy can make more profit.
Right.
Instead, make make the landlord or the developer, whoever it is, the REIT, whatever, apply through a board to say, look, I'm going to do massive massive renovations. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm protecting the tenant. They have right of first refusal. Do you approve me to do this for a renovation?
Right of first refusal is such an important piece of this conversation, because if you really, if you're really not predatorial, then you would absolutely give that, right back to the tenant. Now, I don't want to derail us too far here, but there's a couple of questions that I want to just push to the group. And this is just open. Brenda Diaz has chimed in here. She's just saying, if time's short, in another session, but I wanted to get to this in this session. And there's another question after this. Can you elaborate more on the attributes of this housing entity will have, specifically the regulatory aspect? We can just go down the line here and comment. My quick comment would be, Brenda, thanks for the question. We don't know. And this is the point of being a board, a board in a strategic governance role as your councilor at large, and Joanna as your Ward 1 councilor, is we're not tasked with the operations of whatever it is. All we know is that in our research, when we look across the landscape of municipalities, cities, towns that have done well during the housing crisis, it's ones that have really active either municipal housing corporations or municipal housing authorities or entities of some sort that are big players in that sandbox of housing that are building, but also coordinating and facilitating and doing different things. So that would be my answer. There's all kinds of things they could do. And I don't know, Joe, like if you want to comment on something interesting.
I'm excited to hear what Julia and Jody will say, because they're the types of people that I believe we will be looking to as this comes to be defined, right? And one of the big comments too is that we need something built for St. John, focusing on the issues we have. So we are not Barcelona, we are not Toronto, we are not Yonkers, we're not Vienna. While we certainly can, look to them for certain components of it, we need to look at what the problems we're trying to solve here. So, Julia, Jody.
Julia, you probably have more to say on this topic than I do.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I agree with Joanna. Like, we're gonna have to look at what this looks like for here, right? Who are the players in our game? What land do we have available? What units do we have, et cetera, et cetera. But, the way I see municipal housing corps working is really they're offering a publicly sourced good in the same way a private landlord would, right? So it's, although the money stays in the public hands, right? So it's kind of like owning, like you can basically say like every resident of St. John is a partial owner in this housing corp, right? Our tax money goes into it, tax money builds it, the money stays within that housing corp, right? To redevelop, to do more things, to take on more projects. So that's really how I see these housing corps, and that would be the core definition. It's not to regulate other landlords. Policies take care of that. And we do need stronger policy to do that. But I don't see a municipal housing corp as having any role in that game. I see it as actually offering the function of housing through a public arm.
And I think we have an example here in town, and then I'll push it to somebody else, but we have an example of a municipal entity that does that, which is St. John Energy, which brings in money to the city. In the next 5 years, St. John Energy is estimated to bring in over $5 million in revenue to the city. So that's because 100 years ago, the taxpayers of the city stood this thing up and put in their money, their tax dollars, into creating this energy utility. Now it's always brought back return on investment. It's given our residents lower power rates and everything. But it's the important thing is we're funding something that we use in common, which is energy, and we're coming up with synergetic and efficient forms and uses of that energy and approaches to the energy, to distribution or generation, so that we get maximum return as the common people, rather than leaving it to a private person to get their maximum private return, which is it's a different approach, right? So the housing could be in the exact same stream as that. But there's other things they can do. I don't know, Jody, is there one that you would be looking to see come to the game here?
Well, I just made two comments, and I would say I think St. John Energy. I mean, what a fantastic utility we have in St. John Energy, and some of the stuff they're doing. They're looking with their current project to onboard 15% of their energy use to sustainables, and that's going to increase. So that's a good example of how public dollars can create sustainability. I wouldn't think that a housing entity would be the same. That could be dead wrong, but there is no other energy provider when you're a homeowner that you sign up to. It's St. John
Right.
Energy.
Yeah, it's a monopoly.
We're not
It's a bit
saying, and I
different.
think what you're saying is there is still a private sector housing market. You're not saying it's St. John Energy or St. John Housing, and that's it.
Right.
So there's the differentiator, right? That's and I think also to answer the question from Miss Diaz, I say Miss because I don't remember the first name, is, and this is from my years working in local government, whatever it ends up being is going to be publicly vetted, and you should probably just get involved, because setting the parameters for regulation in that regulatory environment, you wouldn't, if they had, actually, I was waiting to hear what you'd say, because if you guys had an answer, I was going to be disappointed, because you shouldn't know at this stage what the regulatory environment is going to be. You need to research that, vet it, bat it around, get public input. And I would encourage any citizen to get involved, because you don't want it to be weighted too far into like a developer's corner, or too far into like the other side of things. It needs to have that balanced input. So get involved and stay in touch with us.
And that speaks to the news from Misty Schofield that says we'll have to abide by the Residential Tenancy Act, which is, again, we don't know. Like it is, right. It is, yeah. Speaking to your point.
And actually, you know what? The social housing providers right now, New Brunswick Housing, does abide by the Residential Tenancy Act, more or less. Mm-hmm. So it is pretty held to that. Like, you know, and if you look at, let's say Toronto, like Toronto Community Housing Corp, they're a landlord, right? They abide by the Residential Tenancy Act of Ontario. So like those things aren't exclusive.
Mm. And that's where we need the work, right? Like the Residential Tenancies Act is where we need the work for the working poor. You know, I wouldn't qualify myself as, I'm barely middle class, but I have a home, and that gives me a whole slew of privileges. I can cash in on my equity. I can do all kinds of things that apartment dwellers can't. I don't need the same type of protections that somebody who lives in an apartment needs, because at the end of the day, if the landlord doesn't show up and allows the building to fall into chaos, somebody doesn't have a home. But if if there's no tenant in a building for a few months, that landlord still goes back to a home. And so it's an unequitable situation. And it's not to say that landlords aren't taking risk and doing important work, but there is a power imbalance there. And I mean, Joanna, you're a renter.
I'm the only renter on the panel tonight.
Yeah. And you've moved how many times in a year?
3. Yeah.
And we moved. Yeah. It's just, tenants don't have almost any protections under the tenancy.
So I was like the whole person moving in who bought the place, then needs a place needing significant renovations. Then, it's just then, and 60% rent hike, all kinds of fun stuff. So it just, and I feel as someone who, doesn't own a home, who has been a renter for quite some time, I didn't experience this until 2 years ago. Like it was like, circling back to the point at the beginning, it was not as critical of a need. But that doesn't mean that we can't get ahead of the ball game here. And sort of with the conversation tonight, I feel the energy of this issue, right? Like that we're trying to figure out what the best solution is. And I think we really wanted to get that point across tonight on this, that just we put in a motion for an entity, but we're going to need everybody to define what that means, right? It's not just us at all.
And just because I said I would, I want to answer John Kennedy's question here. And it's a question to you, Julia. Is Berlin still a good model to look to, with not only policies to keep rents low, but also incentives to attract and grow artists that in turn build the economy? And I assume by economy he means, quality of life, attractiveness, makes people want to move there, all that.
So we actually haven't heard much about Berlin post-COVID. I haven't heard much about where they're at with their housing. From my understanding, it was once like a cutting edge sort of leading model. in terms of trying to get people to come to the city, but avoid some of the pitfalls of gentrification. But yeah, I haven't heard much in the post-COVID world, so wouldn't quite comment on that. But yeah.
Cool. Well, that gives that. Is there any parting shots from anybody before we're about 10 minutes over the hour here? But is there any parting thoughts or shots anybody wants to give before we go?
I was just going to ask if Julia might send along some recommended reading in the field. Just to, if you guys want to post that. I know you have some people who are interested in this topic, and considering you're deep in this topic and probably read most of the books, maybe there's something they're more accessible for your layperson like me.
Awesome. Okay, I've got some great stuff that I've drummed up. Yeah, maybe if I can task, I know Brent's always good with emailing me and keeping me on task. So maybe if I can task you with sending along a few issues that you think might be good to have some reading on.
Yeah.
I can develop a little, sort of list for them. I can download some articles for some folks, and yeah, we could book club it. St. John Housing Book Club.
I just was going to say that too. St. John Housing Book Club. I love that.
This should be the first thing that comes out of the housing thing is a library. The first thing.
There you go. And you know what? They used to, back in the day, in Victorian times, they used to have these parlors, right? Where people would come together and speak about social issues. So maybe we need to go back to the good old parlor days.
I know somebody that's got a good bar. I know somebody's got a good restaurant, and I know somebody that's got a weird middle place that you can hang out where there's a bunch of tools. So we've all got a place where we can come together and talk housing. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
That's awesome.
Thank
All right.
you
Well,
so much.
yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. Yeah, exactly. And we will absolutely post some of those along. It sounds like a good little series that we can follow up this with.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
for sticking around.
Everybody have a good night.
Cheers.
You too.